So we're just going to double down on the awkwardness of being here for the first time, for those of you that are, because first we talk about money, and then we're going to talk about beer. So we get that that's kind of a strange thing to hear at a church, and we're not hopefully saying that in any kind of braggadocious, rebellious way, but just we were a part of 9 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago. This is the 9th Ales for Trails of this group of people who started this event, and really we kind of carry the bag for it and yet work with a community of people. We've raised over $100,000 for trails in the first 8 years, and really the win of the event for us is to come alongside organizations and entities and individuals who care deeply about some of the same stuff we do. One of our original goals was to work hard to identify areas in our community where we agree, because churches can quickly develop this posture, and Christians can develop this posture of how do we disagree all the time. And it's not that there aren't times that we disagree, but we just thought let's create a different culture and posture than that. And so Trails was one of those. And thus, leading and creating what's become one of the real premier festivals in the state has been a real privilege. We also get that for some of you, alcohol is something that's outside of your moral convictions, and we respect that. For others of you, it's outside of just where you're at in life because you're in recovery, and we applaud you for that and respect you for that. We've done our research. Those people in recovery would tell us that the last thing they need is environments to kind of pamper them, but to say you people in recovery need to be in environments where they can, say no. And so we've kind of dealt with that tension because there's always this empathy that comes up with what about people who are in recovery, and what we've found is that those that are, this is a part of life for you. And so Hannah's working on another scattering event that'll happen around that same time at the YWCA that you can be a part of. If you have issues, please stay away. On the other hand, it's a really fun day, and part of where I get excited about the snow on a day like this is I'm going, okay, there's got to be some math involved in the mathematical probability of it snowing on Ales. So when it does this today, I think our odds get better on Ales, right? So anyway, we'd love for you to be a part of that. I wanted to zoom out a little bit and look at calendar stuff because we're moving into this time of year that happy spring. Isn't that exciting? It's a little ironic this morning. My oldest is playing rugby this year, which if you ever watch high school boys play rugby, you feel like you're watching a crime, only it's legal. It's incredible. A little bit of context, or here's one little snippet. Before his first game, he had asked his coach, sorry if this is too graphic, but this is the way we roll. He'd asked his coach if he could wear a cup, and the coach said no because it messes with the holds. So that's the culture of rugby, just so you know. So I'm just thinking of spring and outside, and isn't it fun to be outside? And suddenly we're stuck inside today so we can get some home chores done today. But looking ahead to the next 4 weeks, next week, don't miss it, really fun, unique weekend. I think it's going to get really real and really refreshing. The following week is Mother's Day. And Mother's Day weekend, a friend of ours, Dr. Dan Bruner, he speaks here about once a year. He's a distinguished professor from Portland Seminary, become a friend of our family, a favorite when he visits. And I asked him this year if he would come on Mother's Day, A, so that I could go to a baseball tournament in town, but B, and speak to this issue of God as mother. And that's not this progressive thing so much as it is recognizing what I hope we all know, which is God doesn't have gender. And though the scriptures are often portrayed through the eyes of men, and we're prone to pronouns like he and his and stuff like that, the reality is the scripture does point to the feminine side of God and what that reveals about God. So it felt appropriate to delve into those waters on Mother's Day weekend. And then the following week, Ales is that Friday. That Sunday, I'm really excited for that one because there's some research out there put together by a guy named Jonathan Narrate that I've been holding for a while, and I still actually haven't resolved this research. It's why I kind of am excited for that week because it'll force me to. But there's some really good data out there that says even those of us who are comfortable attending church and may even identify as Christ followers are really, really struggling to have any kind of spiritual conversations. That outside of the church walls and even within the church walls, we're just culturally, there's just landmines everywhere. There's these kind of hot button phrases everywhere. And so therefore, many of us are just frozen in our marriages, in our friendships, with our roommates, with our kids, with our friends. And so that week, it just felt like Ales weekend would be the perfect time to jump into that. The following Sunday is Memorial Day weekend, and the council made the decision we're shutting down that weekend. So it's a gift to the staff. It's a gift to our Sunday teams. It's really helpful to the staff because it gives us an off season. It gives us a week where we're not preparing for a weekend, but we're zooming out, which we do otherwise. But the other thing that I'm excited about is I think it's going to create a really energetic launch into summer, because on June 2nd, we'll start a brand new series. We're going to do a series. Actually, it was this song that Annie sang that introduced it, this idea about the Holy Spirit, and not the series, but the title for it. What I want to delve into in that series this summer is, like, how do we have an awareness of God's Spirit and not be weird? And I don't mean that disrespectfully, I just mean it honestly. How do we do that? So that's where we're going this summer. This morning, sorry, it's like an endless commercial this morning. So last week was Easter. You probably know that. You may or may not have been with us. And last week, really, we asked this question of, like how have your thoughts on God changed? And part of what we were doing was going, okay, so over the last year, since you got married, since you got divorced, over the last 5 years, over the last 10 years, since you became 70, since you became a widow, since you got that job, since you moved to Helena, how have your thoughts on God changed? And part of what we were trying to name, and we're going to do some more work on this next fall, is the reality that our thoughts on God do change. And to me, one of the tricky things about faith and orthodoxy and some of those big things are, on the one hand, like we're told we're supposed to believe in something and always believe in it. And on the other hand, our culture and our experiences are constantly molding and shaping the way we think about God. You know, I'm reminded of my friend Alan Hirsch, or my professor Alan Hirsch, years ago, who used to say, mystery without study is worthless, and mystery after study is priceless. And I think you can probably appreciate, even in your own field, I see this in the baseball world. Like, I'm just growing more and more fond of those people who know a lot about baseball, but they're the first to say they don't know everything. That they know a lot about something, and yet they're the first to be humble about that. And probably in your field you see that there's a way of like mastering something and thinking you know everything, or there's a way of mastering something and knowing that your mastery means you know less than you thought you did. And I'm hoping that part of what we provoked last week was this posture towards faith that goes, it's not that God is relative, it's that the more we study, the more, it's like when you're a kid and you're unburying a rock from the ground and you thought it was this big, and the more you unbury, the bigger it gets. And so really what we did last week is to go, okay, so how does the resurrection help us in that? You know, I had coffee with somebody who was telling me, he said, you know, Adam, I'm so open to God and ideas about the Bible and different ideas, and I know this person well enough to know, like, he's making some really large strides in who he is and the way he's living and all these things. And he said, I'm so open, it's actually kind of scaring me. And I think last week what we were doing with the resurrection would be my answer to that. That what we explored last week is that Christianity wasn't born of an idea or a superstition. It wasn't some beliefs. It wasn't some person on a mountain who thought they heard from God. That the breaking point of followers of Jesus, that what really brought all of this to fruition was an empty tomb. And that the original followers of Jesus, they were followers of Jesus not because of what they thought was true of him, because they quit believing anything of him when he died. They became followers of Jesus because the tomb was empty, and they had to account for that. And so what I want to do this morning is stay in that track just a little bit. This might be the most boring Sunday ever. You'll have to decide, because what I want to do is get a little didactic and do some apologetics. Now, Apologetics was a really weird band in the 90s. Some of you may remember them. It's also a discipline of saying, here's reasons why we can be confident in what we believe outside of just pointing to the Bible and saying it says it. Now, I don't do a lot of apologetics. We don't do a lot of apologetics because my friend Fred, who influenced me early on, was quick to point out that, Adam, you can beat somebody over the head with facts about why you ought to believe, but in the end, you've just done that. You've convinced them that they'd be intellectually stupid not to believe, but the problem is it doesn't change anything inside of us. So we don't do much, but if we're going to anchor our faith to the resurrection, and that's not to say apologetics don't have value, it's just to say that's my bias. If we're going to anchor faith to the resurrection, and for me, that's the deal. Like, questions about, was Noah a real person or not, that doesn't do anything to my faith. Questions about, was the tomb really empty, that would be catastrophic to me. So, in my bias, I'm constantly watching for evidence that points to the tomb was actually empty. And there's an article that C.S. Lewis wrote years ago, and I've just been holding it and trying to understand it and never thought I'd find a time to use it. And this week I thought, see if I can bore you to tears with this concept. Because here's what he asks. He says, can a scientist believe in the resurrection? I love the premise of the question because it's noting something awesome, and that is we, since 1787 and the French Revolution, have lived in a culture that generally says we find our truth through science. And I don't know about you, I'm grateful to live in that kind of a world. I'm grateful that my friend Mark, that he has 2 new knees, and in his 70s, he can ride his bike again. I'm grateful. I was talking to a guy who set up this morning who just had cataract surgery, and I remember they would lump the front of your eyeball off and then scrape your lens and then put it back on. He said now they take ultrasound, they break it into little tiny pieces, then they vacuum it out of your eye, and then they put a plastic lens back in your eyeball. It's insane, isn't it? But I'm grateful to live in an age where suddenly the signs aren't blurry for him anymore. Grateful to live in an age where we understand that if we don't handle human sanitation and bacteria well, then the plague happens. Grateful to live in an age where giving birth to babies is much more safe than it ever was in the history of the world. Grateful to live in an age where we have medicine and all those different things. Aren't you? Like that we're in a building that was constructed by scientists who understand how to build this stuff. But it exposes this question. So how else do we know something? How else do we believe something? Because if we put it crudely and say that science studies that which is repeatable, then how could we ever, with any kind of rationale, believe in the resurrection? Is the resurrection just a superstitious idea held by people who lived before 1787? Were people in the Old Testament just naive to how death worked? Which, of course, I'm going to suggest is a little bit patronizing, because it assumes that life for us is that much different than it was then, when in fact people have grieved loss for as long as there's been people. But nonetheless, it brings this to the surface. It's this idea of historical evidence. Because what do we do with, say, Caesar crossing the Rubicon? Do we really believe he did that in about 53 BC or whatever it was? What do we do about George Washington being the first president of the United States? What do we do about the idea that there was only one first landing on the moon, unless you played in the NBA, and then there was never a landing on the moon? Like, what do we do about these facts that we go like, that happened, but we can't repeat it? And what was helpful to me was just this category to go, we don't just believe things because of science, we also believe things because of history. And actually, unlikely things become believable all the time. Like 200 years ago, if they would have said that they were going to break up the lens in your eyeball and then suck it out with some kind of vacuum machine and then slide in a plastic lens, you would have said you can't do that. I would imagine it wasn't much longer when things like bypass surgery and artificial knees and all these things. What if the resurrection is more a worldview rub than it is a possible rub? Now, on this issue of like, were ancient peoples just superstitious or ignorant about biology? And here I'm just unapologetically relying upon N.T. Wright's research, but I've found him to be nothing but reliable. He says that if you were to survey ancient cultures leading up to Jesus, there's a broad array of belief about what happens to life after death. And that's probably not a surprise to you or to me. But he also says on the question of, can dead things come alive again? The answer is unanimous. That can't happen. There's one exception, and it's the Jewish people. The Jewish people, very uniquely in ancient history, valued resurrection. Why? Because remember, their faith is rooted in not a God who's pro-spirit, anti-creation, but Judaism, very uniquely in its day, was very pro-created order. That they understood that God was somehow behind creation and that it was for God. And frankly, this is what we're going to do next Easter. It hit me last week halfway through the morning, that the resurrection isn't just about humans. It's about the restoration of all of creation. And so this idea of a God who would do resurrection was very Jewish, to which you could go, okay, well then they made it up, at least Jesus. And here's where this for me was really helpful, and I'm about to get into the meat of what I thought might be helpful to you as you journey through life and faith. What historians do is they look at especially massive shifts that occur. Like there's a way that culture evolves, and then there's a way that culture suddenly shifts. Maybe the iPhone would be an example of a sudden shift. Think of it this way. If 10,000 years from now, historians studying world culture in our day knew nothing of the September 11th attacks, nothing about the 4 airplanes, nothing about the trade towers or the Pentagon, anything about it. They might observe, however, that there was this massive shift that happened in air travel. Like One day you could take your Costco-sized thing of shampoo on the airplane with you. The next day you would spend almost as much for a 4-ounce bottle of shampoo to take that on the airplane with you. Like one day you could take your water with you. The next day your water bottle had to be empty. One day you could just walk onto the plane. The next day there were cavity searches for everybody. Like one day, that hasn't happened to you? Right, like there's this huge shift, and nobody needs me to say all of them are, the innovation of TSA and governmental security and all that stuff. So they would observe that the way air travel happened, it didn't like evolve over a year or 10 years. It was like in a single day almost, it changed. So people who study this stuff historically would go, okay, that tells us that there's a catalyst. A rock was dropped in the pond, and therefore we have ripples. And they would begin to investigate what caused the ripples. This is one way you can look at the resurrection. So there was this idea about resurrection, and it was everywhere within Jewish faith. But after the resurrection, things got really, really narrow. First of all, so I'm just going to pump through these things, and I had too much caffeine, and I'm feeling weird, so sorry if I just talk too fast. They say no spectrum of belief. This is what they mean. Pre-resurrection, all kinds of ideas about what resurrection meant. Pre-Jesus resurrection. There was a smorgasbord. You opened the App Store, bunch of options. For 200 years after what we call Easter, things got really, really narrow, and resurrection meant something very specific. It meant a physical, bodily resurrection made from old parts, but with a new essence, if you will. The other thing that shifted was the centrality of the resurrection. Pre-resurrection, to Judaism, resurrection was important, but not of utmost importance. In fact, the Sadducees didn't even believe in resurrection, and so it was more like this boss thinks being on time is kind of important, new boss thinks it's of utmost importance. N.T. Wright has said it this way for years, and this has always been helpful to me. If you think of the New Testament as a building or a house of cards, all 27 books, if you remove the virgin birth and you go, okay, I'm going to give that one up and say that one's gone, theologically and historically, you lose 4 chapters. It's hard to go to Paul and go, okay, everything about Paul's argument breaks down without the virgin birth. I'm not arguing for that, just making that point. If you remove the resurrection, you lose the whole house. Now, is there a way of doing Christianity without believing in the resurrection? Lots of people are doing that today, but the point would be it became of utmost importance. It is vital to the whole thing, not the case in ancient Judaism. It also became split into 2. Nobody saw resurrection as anything other than something God would do at the end of the age where he would resurrect his people, or some people would say all humanity, all creation, whatever. Nobody saw what the church has taught since, which is Jesus would be resurrected first, and then there'd be this expanse of time, and then the whole resurrection. And what point are we making here? We're only making the point that something may be the cause of this, because they can't find theologians going, oh, I think this is how it'll go. It'll be split in 2. They can't find any evidence that anybody had any kind of idea, anything like that. There's also this thing called collaborative eschatology. Again, the Jewish understanding was not that Jesus would be resurrected, and then God's people, empowered by his Spirit, would kick into gear, and they would instill the resurrection. They would be carriers of it. The kingdom of God now, this is what got Jesus in so much trouble, because they're like, now? Nobody saw it happening that way. Now, we got to be careful here. Those of you who are students of history know that the 20th century, that generation that experienced World War I is often referred to as the lost generation. Why? Because they became so caught up in collaborative eschatology that there was this fundamental belief that humans, in and of themselves, could put creation back to its ideal state. And psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, World War I and then World War II just shattered their worldview because they saw the evil and the pain that humanity was capable of. So are we saying collaborative eschatology as humans, without any help from God, can make utopia? No, that's not the belief, but it is the belief that somehow what you're going to do tomorrow at work matters, and that it somehow contributes to not just gems on a crown, but a world that God is committed to remaking. The 5th thing is this idea of messiahship. And what they mean by this, Ray Vanderlaan has said this rather famously. He said, if you were to ask a Jewish person in Jesus' day, what will the Messiah be like? A way to illustrate their response would be to say, what kind of cars do Americans drive? The idea being like, what? That's way too broad of a question. Everybody had different ideas about what the Messiah would do. Some saw him as a priest, some as a prophet, some as, all combined of those things. There was lots and lots of ideas about messiahship, much like there are about God today. But nobody was assuming that the Messiah would walk out of a tomb alive again, and yet again within Christianity, it's the central thing. But what about the Gospels? And are they reliable? Transitioning into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wouldn't that be convenient? Because all we're doing is arguing from the text. Are the Gospels reliable? 5 more things. Sorry, I know this is very didactic, but I think we can take it to a spot. First thing, the discrepancies in the Gospels. Now, if you've ever read the Gospels, you may be aware that there's some discrepancies, especially around the resurrection moments. Was there one person or two? What exactly order? Was this in Galilee? Was this in Jerusalem? There are discrepancies. I'm just telling you what historians and those who study this say. They would say the discrepancies are a good thing. Like, think of it this way. Your kids get in trouble, you line them out, ask them what happened, they all give you the exact same story. Is that good news or bad news? So what they say is that the discrepancies, they illustrate that the Gospels are actually, that they represent oral traditions that these people had in place, they carried with them for years, and the fact that there are discrepancies actually speaks to the fact that they were recording real historical events. 2 moms watching the same soccer game tell the story differently. You know what I mean? That's what's going on here. The second thing is this, the absence of Old Testament stories. Like, are the Gospels even historically reliable? Well, they would say one of the things that is helpful here, think of it this way, if you go to the movie and it is too close of a parallel to Star Wars, like your brain actually stops thinking and you just start going like, oh, okay, I got it. I got the narrative arc. It's Star Wars. Or you go to a movie and you're like, what the heck? Complete paradigm shift. What historians will say is that when you get to the resurrection accounts, the general lack of reference to the Old Testament would speak to the fact that these people, they weren't able to just plug and play Star Wars. They were suddenly going like, whoa, what is happening here? And they're just recording events without any Old Testament reference. The other thing is women as witnesses. You may have heard this. In the ancient world, if you had a witness to a crime or an event and that witness was a woman, you had no witness. And I suppose some would say, rightly so, that in many cases that we're still there in some places. Interesting thing about the Gospels is that the primary initial witnesses are women, which caused, again, historians like N.T. Wright to go, so either the Gospel writers were moronic, or they're telling the story as it occurred because they didn't even manufacture the idea that the witnesses were men. Fourth thing is this, that Jesus, as represented in the Gospels, is not Jesus as shining like a star. Think of it this way. If you were going to make up a story about someone coming back from the dead alive, would they eat broiled fish? Would they encounter people that they've known for the last 3 years, and those people, their response wouldn't be, whoa, a ghost of Adam, or, whoa, a Marvel superhero. They would just go like, don't recognize him. Like what the Gospels, interestingly enough, do is they portray Jesus in a resurrected form that's physical, but not this like crazy, what we would think of as an angel or a supernatural thing. And again, the point is that historians are saying if you were going to make this thing up, he'd probably be 14 feet tall and glow like a star. Fifth thing is this, the absence of Christian hope. I had a friend who was at church last weekend who went through some tough stuff this year, to say the least, and I was able to say to them, you coming to church on Easter weekend is one of the single most courageous things I've seen in recent memory. Why? Because what do you expect to hear at church on an Easter weekend? And it's not that it's not valuable, it's not that it's not important, but if you lost a loved one in that year, what do you show up expecting? Maybe some false empathy that says, oh, don't worry about it, at least they're going to heaven. Here's the thing about the gospel accounts. They don't do that. The Gospels don't actually ever connect the meaning of Jesus' resurrection to your life in Helena, Montana in 2019. Now, that's not to say that the New Testament doesn't. That's what makes writings like Paul so important and the early church and the theology work done. But the Gospels themselves, they don't, and this might be one way to say it, they don't do a bunch of theologizing at the end of the event. They just record the event. Why? Well, one option would be because their original purpose was to do just that. to record the event. So what are we doing here? And I get it, we're speaking more to head probably this morning than heart, but what are we doing? Well, I hope, what we're doing is we're asking this question, can a scientist believe in the resurrection? And we're exposing the fact that while a very good question, we as a culture in the 21st century, on the other side of 1787, who are grateful to live in a scientific age, we still believe things that can't be redone. We can't observe them over and over and over again. And the word we have for that is history. And the real rub, perhaps, is one of worldview. Because I think you could hear all this, and this is my point about apologetics, and you could go, yeah, I get it. Okay, so the theology about resurrection changed dramatically. I get it. The Gospels seem to be pretty historical documents. Okay, but I still don't buy it. Which would be fine, wouldn't it? But I wonder if the value there is to go, that's fine, but you're not doing that because we've broken some rules about what rational people in the 21st century can believe. You're doing that for some other reason. And we've probably all done that at some season of our life for another reason. What's the rub? I wonder if the rub is worldview. It's Thomas in John's gospel who, when he finally had this moment of believing the resurrection, said, "My Lord and my God." It's this realization that if this historical event is true, the implications are huge. That if the historical event is true, it's an invitation, if not a mandate, to reframe our entire existence around that one point of history. Because if the tomb was empty, then suddenly your reason for getting out of bed tomorrow, your reason for being a human on the planet shifts. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you all have to go get a job at a church, and it doesn't mean that we've all got to start using religious talk. It just means that those interactions in the hallways, those diapers that you're going to change, those interpersonal and intrapersonal moments, it's an invitation, isn't it? To stepping into a life where we go, the kingdom of God is at hand, and now everything I do matters. I would like to think, it's the crux of, the core of, the launching point of what it means to be a gathering, scattering community, my understanding of church. It's not that we all do religious stuff and do it more often. It's that we step into our everyday lives knowing the invitation of Christ is that we're a part of his restoration of culture. And therefore, whether that's a wrapper on the ground or a person that we're going to tend to or a different way of engaging in a conflict, it's an invitation to be a part of the kingdom of God. What if the resurrection isn't just a superstitious belief held by people who lived before a scientific age? What if it was a very catalytic, historic moment that caused people to completely reshape and reframe their lives? And what if there is value as Christ followers to knowing that it's not just a religious idea, but the accounts of it can be pointed to with some pretty firm historical evidence to go, no, I have the option to believe in something that actually very well may have happened. In fact, I believe that it did. So listen, I get it. If you woke up this morning struggling in a relationship, a marriage, wherever that's at for you, there's a little bit more work, but it's a reminder that all the work we do on the emotional, relational side of things, it's not based upon a mystical claim. It's based upon a historic moment that we can at least choose to have confidence in believing that it actually happened, and therefore it became the catalyst of a completely new world. I'd like to pray, and we'll give you a second to take a deep breath and sing. God, thanks, God, for apologists. Thanks for guys like N.T. Wright and Lee Strobel and Josh McDowell and Rabbi Zacharias and people who, they do the heavy lifting of helping ensure us that we have an actual verifiable faith in the midst of a scientific world. God, thanks that you're bigger than our constructs, that you invite us into knowing and to mystery. Thanks for the lives of people that we get to learn from in the text and the fact that you've not given us everything, but you've given us enough. Thanks, God, that you conquered evil, that somehow death lost, and that we have the invitation to be a part of your new creation starting now. We love you, God. Amen.
Good morning. My name's Hannah, and this is Adam. In a moment, our ushers are going to come forward with our offerings. So if you take ownership in giving, you can prepare for that now. If not, or you're a guest with us, just let the buckets go right by you. To be here at Narrate is to gather and to scatter. So we gather here on Sunday mornings at Grand Street. We work hard to talk about topics that are relevant to you in your everyday life. And then the rest of the week, we like to get into our community and scatter. We like to serve and love people where they're at. Yeah, that was an awkward transition. So yeah.
What was more awkward is that I forgot to unmute my mic. Sorry. So every once in a while we do this thing called a financial update. So sorry about that if you're a guest with us. Just a little bit of context there is we recognize that maybe the biggest thing between you and healthy relationships with places like this is the conversations about money, and so we own that, we respect that. We also value serving people by gathering and scattering, and quite frankly, to do that involves people who believe in the vision of this and what God is doing through local church enough to be vested through their own income and their own resource. And so periodically we have to talk about that. And a couple background things is please know that I don't know who gives what, and Hannah doesn't, and Kate doesn't, and neither does anybody else from the staff know, except for one person who, of course, manages the finances, and her name's Doris, and she runs several small countries and Narrate, so it's perfect. But we say that because we don't ever want our interactions, out and about to in any way be impacted by that. We value the anonymity of that for you. And yet, as a community, there's also a reality to all of this. And so we've got some numbers. You can put up that slide. Our fiscal year runs September through August, so we're coming up into the last third or so of that, and that's unique for us to put one up there that shows a net negative. So let me give a little context there. First of all, nobody's panicking, nobody's getting laid off. I'm not giving that to say look at Hannah. Do you really like her? She's not going to have a job tomorrow if you don't fix that. There's none of that happening. In fact, I'm really, really proud of our council. I don't know of another church. I'm sure there are some that manages resources the way they do, but part of their value from the very beginning has been to manage some emergency reserves. We don't have property. We don't have the types of things that you would generally leverage a line of credit against. And so they've always wanted to make sure that we had the capital to weather storms like this. And really what's going on here, we think, but we don't know yet, is we got rid of a third of our gatherings. So some of you know in September we went from 8:30 and 10 to 11:30 to just 9 and 10:30. And so obviously we removed a third of our seats, and we didn't have any idea what kind of impact that would have. It's had less of one, frankly, than we thought it might financially, and yet it still had one, we think. So what this means is I just want to respect you enough to give you the information. I don't think we've ever stood up here and given a negative of that big, but we have stood up here before and given positives that were even bigger, and so it just felt integrous to go here's the facts. Nobody's panicking. We are hopeful. The real work is going to happen this summer when we set the budget for the next budget year, which will start in September. And again, that we'll manage that as we get closer to it. But just wanted to respect you and say, there's the data. Thank you. I mean, I get it. Your giving check, those are car payments. That's college savings. That's another night out. I mean, we get that we have fixed incomes, and life is expensive, and kids are expensive, and medical stuff is expensive. And so our commitment is to continue to try to be a generous organization that exists for as long as people are bought in through their time and their resource. So obviously, $310,000, those are real dollars and real giving, so thank you for that. There's also a component that Hannah's going to bring that Kate and Doris have been working on really hard for a couple months that we're excited to finally talk about.
Yeah, so we're diving right into the 21st century here, and we're introducing a giving app. So it's called Church Center app. So if you have a smartphone and you work with apps and all that stuff, it's very intuitive and very user-friendly, so I don't think you'll have a problem. It took me maybe a minute to set it up, so it's pretty easy. If not, no worries, I'll walk you through it quick. So in your little app store, you're just going to look for the Church Center app with a blue and green church-like building. And then, what do I do next? Oh yeah, you search for Narrate Church. So there's a few churches in Helena.
Or your zip code.
Or your zip code?
I think so.
My location services are on. I'm one of those people, so it just pulled up.
Oh, yeah.
But Scott,
Which also means
his
your
are
battery
off.
is perpetually dead.
True. So look for Narrate Church, and then it's going to ask you for your phone number, email, and it'll send you a little code just to make sure it's actually you signing up for the app. And then you're pretty much all set. You can save your credit card in there, a bank account, and it'll keep track of your giving history. What else?
Yeah, and the transaction fees are pretty, for the credit card
25
side, it's pretty normal, but the great news is if you give directly, there's a technical phrase for that.
Yeah, I don't know it.
I don't either. But if
Okay.
you enter your checking account number, then it's a quarter per transaction, no matter the amount. Which that was a big deal because we've been researching a lot of these, and some of them were quite significant in the monthly cost. And this one is connected with Planning Center, which is another app we use. And someday we hope to use. There's a function of this where you can check your kids in to Narrate Kids from home.
Oh,
So
that'd be awesome.
we're working
not
on,
that
but
I have
we're not
kids
there
that use
yet.
that, but-
But yeah.
So if you have any
not gonna touch that one.
questions, Jolene will be at the scattering table in the back. If you have any questions, she'll be happy to get you all set up.
Yeah, so this morning, if you came intending to give, you can pull out your phone or hit the bucket or just let it pass right by you.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.